Later that evening, as twilight settled over the thatched roofs and the lanes emptied of gossipers and glances, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, knitting set aside. On the small table beside her lay a crumpled programme from the garden gala. She smoothed it out with a fingertip. Edwin's name was not listed among the expected attendees. Nor, she noted, was Mr. Prowse's. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting indeed. She rose and moved to her writing desk, where she made a note on a piece of linen paper to find out who invited Mr. Prowse, and why did he. Come outside. The church bell rang the hour, and somewhere far off, a fox called through the hedgerows. Lower Bentham slept restlessly, the spectre of murder having unsettled its dreams. Miss Marple, however, did not sleep. She had seen something yesterday, not dramatic or loud, but something that didn't fit, a minor detail, unremarked by others, and when things didn't fit, she knew from experience. It was because they had been deliberately forced into place. She poured herself a final cup of tea, and looked again at the list of attendees. Now, she said softly, who brought the red ledger? The morning sun spilled golden light across the neat hedgerows and low stone walls of Lower Bentham, belying the tension that had settled like a mist over the village. Despite the picturesque calm, the cheerful rustling of robins, the clatter of milk bottles on cottage steps, there was an unspoken shift in the air, a change in rhythm. Doors opened more cautiously, and neighbours spoke in quieter tones. Even the dogs barked less. At the vicarage, Inspector Armitage was already hard at work, his notebook filled with scrawled observations and names underlined with fervour. In his mind, the pieces were falling together neatly. Edwin Thatcham, the prodigal son, the disgraced heir, the charming intruder, was the sort of man Armitage distrusted on sight, and now, as it happened, he had both a motive and an opportunity. But Miss Marple, in her modest drawing-room overlooking the village green, was thinking differently. She had learned long ago that tidy solutions often masked untidy truths, and the more she considered Mr. Prowse's death, the more she was convinced the motive was not money, or not entirely. By mid-morning, she had set out for a discreet round of visits, her straw handbag neatly packed with lemon biscuits and a ball of pale blue yarn. It was, as ever, Miss Marple's way to appear aimless, even whimsical. In truth, she had already compiled a list of those whose accounts of the day required clarification. Her first stop was the bookshop, though not for a book. The shop was owned by Phyllis Brent, a woman of quiet habits and a startlingly sharp tongue when she deemed it necessary. She had also been on the gala's organising committee and would know who had invited whom. Miss Marple. Phyllis greeted her with weary cheer as the little bell over the door rang. "You're just in time. I've been rearranging the poetry shelf, and everything's in the wrong place again. Tennyson in with the travelogues." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, stepping in with the sort of delight reserved for casual browsers. "Books do tend to migrate when they're unhappy. I suppose Tennyson longed for adventure." Phyllis smirked, then lowered her voice. "You're here about Mr. Prowse, aren't you? I had wondered," Miss Marple said gently, who extended the invitation. "He wasn't listed on the programme." "No, he wasn't," Phyllis replied, turning slightly to pull a thin, rolled copy of the day's leaflet from a drawer. "He hadn't attended for years, said it was beneath him, to pedestrian, but Clarissa Mott insisted he be included this time, said it would be good for appearances." Miss Marple blinked. "Clarissa, how very thoughtful of her." Phyllis gave a sideways glance. "Thoughtful isn't quite the word I'd use. Strategic, perhaps. You know how she's been ever since she took over the Thatcham household as Slate. I dare say she preferred him, where she could see him." Miss Marple left with a copy of The Lark Ascending, and more questions than answers. Her next stop was the Thatcham estate itself. Once a proud manor, the house had lost its gloss in recent years. The paint on the shutters was peeling. The gravel path crunched unevenly beneath her sensible shoes. Clarissa Mott answered the door. Herself, a pressed linen blouse fastened to the throat, and her hair in a tight chignon. If the events of the past 2 days had disturbed her, it did not show. Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple said mildly. I was just passing. And I wondered how you were bearing up. Clarissa stepped aside. Tea, they sat in the morning room, its once-grand furnishings dulled with time. Clarissa poured with precision, her movements restrained, her face a porcelain mask. I understand you were the one who invited Mr. Prowse to the gala, Miss Marple said after a delicate sip. Such a thoughtful gesture. Clarissa's spoon paused in mid-stir. I didn't think it would become a topic of interest, she said coolly. But yes, I asked him. I thought perhaps his presence would encourage Edwin to behave with discretion. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, so it was Edwin you were trying to manage. Clarissa looked away for a moment. You know what people think of him, that he's only returned for the will. But he was our mother's son too, and Miss Pomfrey cared for him once. He had a right to be there, a right, Miss Marple echoed gently, but not necessarily an invitation. Clarissa set her cup down a shade too firmly. Miss Marple, I fail too. See how any of this is relevant. Mr. Prowse is dead, and Edwin had nothing to gain from it. Miss Marple smiled benignly. Oh, people gain things in all sorts of ways, my dear. Peace, for instance. Or silence. She left shortly afterward, her expression pleasant, but her thoughts carefully assembling themselves. On her way back through the village, she paused near the schoolhouse, where Sylvia Grange was emerging with a stack of papers under her arm. Miss Marple, Sylvia looked relieved, though still pale. I was hoping I'd see you. I haven't been able to think straight since everything. Miss Marple took her arm gently and guided her toward the stone bench beneath the elm tree. I wonder, she said, if you could help me with something. Just a trifle, really. I've been thinking about the moment you found Mr. Prowse. You said he was lying near the ornamental pond. Yes, Sylvia nodded. Half in the flowers. He'd dropped his cup. It was nowhere near him. That's what struck me first. It was several feet away, almost as if someone had placed it there, or removed it. Miss Marple asked. Sylvia's brow furrowed. I suppose, but why? To delay discovery of the poison, perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. But that would require presence of mind, someone calm under pressure. That's quite rare, unless it was planned. Sylvia was silent for a long moment. Do you think it was really about money? That someone wanted Miss Pomfrey's inheritance so badly? I think, said Miss Marple softly, that money often serves as the mask for something deeper, resentment, shame, secrets. Back at home that evening, Miss Marple unfolded the now heavily marked programme and laid it beside a map of the vicarage garden. A modest reproduction, to be sure, but enough to remind her of the layout. She traced her finger from the refreshment table to the ornamental pond, the cup missing, the wasp that had hovered near the tarts, Clarissa's insistence, Edwin's charm. Mr. Prowse's knowledge of secrets. There was one more stop she would make tomorrow. Someone who knew records, ledgers, accounts, Mr. Prowse had once said, with that thin smile of his, that no misdeed in Lower Bentham ever stayed hidden for long once it made its way into his red ledger, and Miss Marple suspected that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure a particular entry was never made. The knitting resumed in her lap, but her mind continued weaving something else entirely, threads of motive, memory, and misdirection. Tomorrow she would call on a certain Mr. Langley, the village solicitor, and she would ask him one very simple question. Who else knew what was written in Mr. Prowse's red ledger? By Thursday morning, the village of Lower Bentham had moved from shock to speculation, and from speculation to certainty, at least in the minds of its more outspoken residents. Rumour had evolved into consensus, and consensus, as ever in such places, had selected a prime suspect. It was, of course, Edwin Thatcham, at the village bakery. Mrs. Fanshawe told anyone who would listen that she'd never trusted a man who wore cream trousers and drank lemonade with a twist of lime. At the greengrocer's, young Timothy Briggs muttered darkly about inheritance and deceit while rearranging apples with what could only be described as righteous fervour. Even the vicar had made a subtle allusion in his morning sermon to the return of prodigals and the troubling persistence of old sins. Inspector Armitage, meanwhile, was quietly building his case. Edwin Thatcham had arrived with little warning, had been seen near the refreshments table minutes before Mr. Prowse's collapse, and had, by all accounts, a rather contentious history with the deceased. More to the point, Edwin had recently made inquiries known to discreet about the late Miss Pomfrey's will, and as Armitage was fond of saying, people did not ask about money unless they intended to collect it. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She had spent the better part of the morning in her sitting room, arranging her notes as carefully as her knitting patterns. The red ledger, the phrase, had surfaced again and again. Always in whispers, always with caution, Alfred Prowse, in his capacity as chairman of the Garden Club and former estate manager to the Thatchams, had maintained meticulous records. Not just financial ledgers, but personal one as petty grievances, misdeeds, obligations. His memory had been long, and his pen had been exacting. The ledger itself had not yet been found, but the ripples it had caused could still be felt throughout the village. It was with this thought that Miss Marple donned her gloves and set off for the solicitor's office near the end of Bramble Lane. Mr. Langley, a tall, tired-looking man with spectacles forever slipping down his nose, was the sort of solicitor who preferred deeds to people, and had a long-standing agreement with Miss Marple to provide answers in exchange for her shortbread. She brought a full tin. He greeted her with a nod and a sigh. "I should have known you'd be by, and I should have known you'd be expecting me," she replied, taking a seat across from his desk. "Now, tell me, what exactly do you know about Mr. Prowse's records?" Langley's eyebrows rose a fraction. "You mean his infamous red ledger?" Miss Marple smiled. "I do so enjoy when things live up to their reputation." Langley tapped his pen against a folder. "It exists, or existed, kept in a locked drawer in his study. Not part of any official capacity, of course, but everyone knew about it. Quietly, that is. People were nervous around Alfred. He had a memory for details and a habit of jotting them down, mostly harmless things, small missteps, but some he hesitated. Some were more damaging." She offered. He gave a resigned nod. "Yes. I know for a fact that he once helped a woman renegotiate her lease by reminding her landlord of certain indiscretions during the war. He called it leverage. Others might have called it blackmail, though nothing ever stuck. Was Edwin Thatcham mentioned in that ledger?" Langley leaned back in his chair. "Very likely. Mr. Prowse managed Colonel Thatcham's estate before it collapsed. There were irregularities. I believe Edwin was blamed for some poor investments, though I don't know how much of that was true and how much family politics. The Colonel was never one to share burdens." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And who else might have feared what the ledger contained?" Langley looked uncomfortable. "It would be easier to list who didn't. I'd say half the village had reason to be nervous. Clarissa Mott, for one. Mr. Prowse helped her cover the estate's tax mismanagement after the Colonel died. He was also very close with Miss Pomfrey before she changed her will 2 years ago." "Changed her will?" Langley blinked. "You didn't know?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Perhaps you'd better explain." "She revised it," Langley said, retrieving a file from his drawer. "Initially, it left the bulk of her estate to Edwin, as he was her godson, but after his disappearance, she really adjusted, left a portion to local charities. a stipend to Clarissa, and a small sum to Mr. Prowse. For services rendered, she said. And Edwin. Langley looked sheepish. She left him a single item, her father's pocket watch, to remind him that time, once lost, cannot be regained, rather poetic, if one's in the mood for cruelty. Miss Marple thanked him, left behind the shortbread, and walked home slowly, her thoughts churning. The narrative forming around Edwin was too clean, too expected. He had a motive, certainly, but it was a motive known to all. Convenient, easy, and Miss Marple suspected entirely deliberate. Back in her parlour, she reviewed what she had gathered. Mr. Prowse had known something he had likely intended to use, or had already used to influence one of the villagers. He had been invited to the gala by Clarissa, ostensibly to keep Edwin in check. But what if that invitation had been about something else entirely? Control, perhaps, or timing. And then there was the curious detail of the missing cup. She had seen it before. Not at the scene, but in a photograph published in the local paper. The week prior, Mr. Prowse, standing beside his ornamental pond, cup in hand, notebook tucked beneath one arm, he had liked to write in the garden. Had the murderer known this? Had they lured him there with the promise of a quiet conversation? She would need to speak with Clarissa again, and perhaps with Edwin as well, if only to see what they would reveal when pressed. That evening, as the village lights flickered on one by one, and the lanes emptied once more of curious glances, Miss Marple sat quietly beside her fire, the knitting untouched in her lap. She was not yet certain who had killed Alfred Prowse, but she was quite sure of one thing. The killer had wanted more than to silence a man. They had wanted to erase something entirely. And in Lower Bentham, where secrets were layered as thickly as scones with jam, that meant only one thing. The Red Ledger had not only recorded misdeeds, it had become a weapon. And someone had killed to keep it from being read. The next day dawned heavily with clouds, casting a grey pall over Lower Bentham that seemed to mirror the deepening unease in its narrow lanes and manicured gardens. A soft drizzle began just after breakfast and stayed like an unwanted guest, coating everything. In a damp hush, it was the sort of weather that made villagers talk in whispers and draw their curtains an hour early. At the vicarage, Inspector Armitage paced beside the fire, tapping his pen against the side of his notebook, though outwardly he continued to assert that Edwin Thatcham was the most likely culprit. A creeping doubt had begun to unsettle his otherwise tidy theory. The poison, the cup, the ledger that everyone seemed to know about but no one could find it was all beginning to feel too constructed, too theatrical, still. The inspector was a man of duty and forward momentum, and he pressed on. A second interview with Edwin had yielded more irritation than revelation, with the man becoming increasingly defensive and sarcastic. If I had anything to gain from Alfred's death. Edwin had snapped. Don't you think I would have waited until after the will was read? Poisoning him in the middle of a garden party makes me look like a cartoon villain. Armitage had not appreciated the tone, but he'd made note of the logic, elsewhere in the village. Miss Marple was engaged in her own quiet investigation. She had spent the early part of the morning walking through the vicarage garden with Reverend Harmon's blessing, retracing the moments before and after Mr. Prowse's collapse. The ornamental pond glistened under the light drizzle, its surface disturbed only by the occasional drop of rain or darting insects. She paused at the flower bed where the body had fallen. Though the grass had been trampled and the blooms damaged, something peculiar caught her eye. She bent with effort, brushing back a wilted leaf. A faint trail, barely visible, of dark red powder, not earth, not pollen, something finer, more deliberate. Miss Marple removed a small envelope from her handbag and used the tip of her knitting needle to gently scoop a trace of the powder inside. She sealed the envelope, then stood slowly, brushing damp soil from her skirt. She'd seen something similar once before during a particularly unwholesome bridge game in Chichester involving a bottle of snuff that had been tampered with to deliver powdered sleeping draught. It had left a similar mark, but this, she suspected, was not snuff. This was cosmetic powder, specifically rouge, a strange thing to find near a dying man. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the village apothecary, a little shop tucked behind the library with a faded sign that read Turner's Remedies and Tinctures. Behind the counter stood young Bernard Turner, bespectacled and always slightly pink in the ears, who lit up at the sight of Miss Marple. Miss Marple, what a surprise. Is it rheumatism again? Not today, Bernard, she said kindly, handing over the envelope. I wonder if you might take a look at this. Just a little something I found in the garden and found rather curious. He examined the powder under a small magnifying lens. It's a cosmetic compound, a type of rouge, I'd say, cheap. Mass-produced, the sort used in stage makeup or sold in bulk. Not the sort of thing we stock, of course, but common enough in the city. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And would it contain any irritants? Something that might cause a reaction if inhaled? Well, some do, he said thoughtfully, especially the cheaper brands. If someone were particularly sensitive or if a large amount were used, it might irritate the eyes, nose, even the lungs, but it wouldn't kill. No, Miss Marple agreed. Not by itself. She left the apothecary deep in thought. Rouge near the scene of the crime, a missing teacup, a ledger that had vanished, and Clarissa Mott. Ever polished, ever composed, whose face, Miss Marple now recalled, bore no hint of cosmetic indulgence. To dignified, to practical, but there had been one woman at the gala who'd worn rather a bold shade of rouge, Miss Lavinia Fawcett. Lavinia was the niece of old Miss Pomfrey's former housekeeper and had returned to the village only a few months ago following a failed engagement in London. She'd taken up lodging above the butcher's shop and had thrown herself into village life with an enthusiasm that many found suspiciously energetic. She had also, it was whispered, spent rather a lot of time with Mr. Prowse in recent weeks. Miss Marple decided to call on her. Lavinia opened the door wearing a silk scarf knotted at the neck and a curious expression. She looked surprised but smiled quickly. Miss Marple, do come in. I was just having a little something warm. The rooms were small but tidy, filled with scented candles and floral cushions. A tray of tea sat on the table beside a bottle of bright pink nail varnish and a compact case of rouge. Miss Marple noted the Branle Belle Rose. Such a charming place, she said warmly, settling into the offered chair. The air was soft with the scent of roses, the hum of bees mingling with the polite murmur of afternoon conversation. St. Hedwig's Garden Club Gala was in full swing on the vicarage lawn, an annual event as predictable as the changing seasons, and attended with a ritualistic precision by the good people of Lower Bentham. The bunting flapped lazily in the July breeze, and the Victoria sponges, teetering with cream and jam, stood in disciplined ranks beside cucumber sandwiches and bone china teacups. Miss Marple sat under the shade of a silver birch, knitting needles in hand and eyes more watchful than anyone might guess beneath her dovegrey hat. She was ostensibly engrossed in a pair of socks for her nephew Raymond, but her gaze moved gently from group to group, observing the subtle interplay of smiles to tight, glances to brief, and silences just a beat too long. I say, Miss Marple, chirped Mrs. Agnes Weatherby, pausing before her with a glass of elderflower cordial and a radiant, if slightly fixed, smile. What a day, what perfect weather for the gala. Miss Marple looked up with a gentle nod. Indeed, Agnes, though I do hope they've secured the jam tent better than last year. You remember the wind carried off Mrs. Duncliffe's preserves like Dorothy's house in The Wizard of Oz. Poor dear was never quite the same. Mrs. Weatherby tittered. Oh yes, quite. Though I expect the only thing being blown about today is village gossip. Did you hear that Edwin Thatcham has returned from Buenos Aires, and looking very well fed, I might add? Edwin, Miss Marple murmured, eyes narrowing just a touch. That is unexpected. The return of Edwin Thatcham, son of the late Colonel Thatcham and prodigal heir to the once-respected Thatcham estate, had sent a ripple through the village like a pebble into still water. He'd vanished nearly 15 years ago after some financial scandal involving his father's accounts, whispers of debts, perhaps even theft, though nothing was ever proven. And now, here he was, smiling and sun-bronzed, mingling as though he had never left. He stood now at the far end of the lawn, surrounded by a curious knot of villagers, telling some undoubtedly embellished tale of gauchos and gold. His sister, Clarissa Motley Thatcham, stood rigid beside him, her lips thin and her white-gloved hands clenched just a little too tightly around her parasol. Clarissa doesn't look too pleased. Miss Marple observed mildly, "Well, would you be, Mrs. Weatherby?" Leaned in. "He's returned just in time for the reading, I'm told. Old Miss Pomfrey passed. You knowed Wynne was her godson. She always said she'd leave him something. Of course, we all assumed that would never matter." The conversation halted as a loud, sharp cry rang out, heads turned, at the far end of the vicarage garden, beside the ornamental pond. Someone had stumbled. A young woman in pale yellow Sylvia Grange, the new schoolmistress, was kneeling over a motionless figure sprawled half in the petunias. "Oh heavens!" someone gasped. "It's Mr. Prowse." Indeed it was. Alfred Prowse, chairman of the garden club, and a fastidious man known for both his begonias and his blackmail, lay with eyes wide open to the summer sky, lips purpled, and skin already taking on an unnatural pallor. The teacups fell silent, the bees buzzed on. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her bag. "I do believe," she said, rising with perfect composure, "that we've had quite enough excitement for one afternoon." The following morning, lower, Bentham stirred beneath a cautious sun, its usual rhythms interrupted by the scandal of murderer, as the newspaper would later call it. An untimely and most regrettable death under suspicious circumstances. In a village where the most thrilling recent event had been the arrival of a new postmistress with auburn hair and a fondness for shortbread, this was nothing short of an earthquake. At the Bell and Whistle, the only pub worth frequenting within a 6-mile radius, speculation bubbled as vigorously as the tea in its tarnished copper urn. By 10 o'clock, 3 firm theories and 1 ghost story had taken root. "It was poison," declared Mr. Ned Wickens, tapping the bar with the handle of his walking stick. "Mark my words. Man doesn't drop dead with eyes bulging like that unless he's been dosed." Mrs. Joan Maplethorpe, keeper of the post office and a woman with a memory like a ledger, sniffed. "And who, pray tell, would poison poor Mr. Prowse during a garden gala, of all places?" "Oh, you'd be surprised, Joan," said Dotty Fanshawe from her place near the fireplace. "Murder doesn't follow manners. If a soul's had enough of you, they'll find their moment, Bunting and Victoria, sponge or no." The pub's backroom filled with low mutterings as a name surfaced, hesitant at first but growing in boldness. Edwin Thatcham. After all, hadn't he arrived only days ago? Wasn't he bound to inherit something from Miss Pomfrey's estate? And hadn't Mr. Prowse once managed his late father's accounts? Coincidence? Ned muttered, shaking his head. "Don't believe in 'em." Across the village green, a quieter conversation took place over teacups and ginger snaps in the parlour of Miss Marple's cottage. Present were the vicar's wife, Mrs. Drusilla Harmond, and young Sylvia Grange, the very woman who had discovered the body. Miss Marple had offered her visitors chamomile tea and a gentle listening ear, both of which were eagerly accepted. "I keep seeing him," Sylvia whispered, holding her cup with trembling fingers. "The way his eyes were fixed like glass, I didn't even know I'd screamed. It just happened. Shock does peculiar things," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but steady. I once saw a woman faint in Harrods because a man dropped a briefcase full of fish knives. I thought it was a bomb. Sylvia let out a weak chuckle. Mrs. Harmond patted her hand. It's not your fault. Dear, you simply happened to be the one to find him, but the village will talk. You know how people are. Miss Marple's eyes moved from Sylvia to the window, where two magpies hopped across the grass with indignant energy. People will always talk, she said thoughtfully. But the truth is seldom as simple as what is first whispered. I don't understand why anyone would want Mr. Prowse dead, Sylvia murmured. He was, well, not exactly kind, but he knew everyone's business, Miss Marple said gently. And in a place like Lower Bentham, knowing too much is often more dangerous than being unkind. Mrs. Harmond looked surprised. Surely you don't mean? I mean only that Alfred Prowse had a rather uncommon talent for reminding people of things they wished forgotten. I remember he once told poor Mrs. Evers that he had an accounting of her errors dating back to the spring fete of 1939. She never so much as baked a scone in public again. The three women fell into a silence, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant squawk of a pigeon. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly as if translating the rhythm of her thoughts into wool. It wasn't long before word arrived that Inspector Armitage had been summoned from Much Willingford, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for efficiency and an unfortunate fondness for assuming guilt before evidence. He arrived just after luncheon and made himself known by storming through the village in polished shoes and a scowl. He set up his base of operations at the vicarage, commandeering the breakfast room as a temporary office. Villagers were called in one by one, statements taken, names scribbled in a leather-bound notebook with a pencil that seemed permanently angry. Miss Marple was interviewed last. Miss Marple, said the inspector, his voice carrying the false patience of a man convinced he already knew the answer. You were present at the garden gala yesterday. I was, yes, she said, her voice steady and polite. And did you notice anything unusual before Mr. Prowse's collapse? Oh, she said, her eyes innocent behind wire-rimmed spectacles. There was a wasp near the custard tarts, and Mrs. Fanshawe dropped her glove into the punch bowl, but nothing that seemed particularly fatal. He blinked. I meant unusual in terms of behaviour. Between people, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Behaviour is always unusual if you know what to look for. People wear habits. Like clothes, Inspector, a change in either is always worth noting. The inspector gave her a tight nod. We've had the remains of Mr. Prowse's cup sent for analysis. There was a faint almond scent. Cyanide, she asked mildly. He seemed surprised. Yes, how did you do? Oh. I once read a very instructive case in the Daily Mirror, quite thorough reporting, though the crossword was disappointing that day. He frowned. Miss Marple, I assure you I have this well in hand. Edwin Thatcham had motive, proximity, and a rather convenient reason to be rid of Mr. Prowse. His arrival is too neatly timed. The man's past speaks for itself. I dare say it does, Miss Marple agreed. But then, pasts often speak out of turn, don't they, especially when they've been silenced for a while. As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple strolled slowly past the churchyard, her mind working gently but without pause. She thought of Edwin Thatcham, so bold and charming at the garden party. She thought of Clarissa Mott, stiff and brittle as dried lavender. She thought of Sylvia Grange, wide-eyed and shaken, and of Alfred Prowse, cold in death yet still managing to cast shadows. There was something missing. Not from the scene itself, though the cup had not yet been found, curiously, but from the story everyone had constructed around it. The villagers, the inspector, even Sylvia. Everyone had accepted death as a result of the present. Miss Marple suspected it was tied far more deeply to the past. There had been no dark stranger, no outlandish motive, no shadowy past filled with malice, only a frightened woman and a decision that spiraled out of control. Miss Marple sat quietly by her sitting-room window, watching the pale autumn light spill across the hedgerows. She had declined all invitations that day, though several had arrived. Mrs. Fanshawe with a seed cake and urgent questions. Young Timothy Briggs with an imploring look and a nervous desire to talk through every detail. She needed no further explanation. She had seen enough, and what remained unsettled was not fact, but feeling. The red ledger had been returned to the custody of the inspector, who now regarded it as something more than evidence. It was a reminder, testament to how much danger a single book could hold in a village like theirs. How easily truth, when written down, could tear the veil from long-concealed wounds. Miss Marple had read the last page once more before handing it over. Let the guilty beware. It was not a threat, she had come to understand, but a lament. Alfred Prowse had not only recorded secrets, he had carried them, and in the end, he had chosen exposure over silence, not because he sought vengeance, but perhaps because he no longer trusted himself to judge what was worth protecting. It was this quiet truth that guided Miss Marple that afternoon as she returned to the vicarage at the inspector's invitation. The sitting-room had been tidied, the fire lit. A pot of tea rested on the table between them, its aroma hinting at cloves and orange peel. "I must admit," Inspector Armitage said, pouring her a cup, "I didn't expect it to be her." "Most people didn't," Miss Marple replied, accepting the cup with a nod. She seemed so innocent. He frowned. "And yet you knew." "I suspected she would." "Correct it gently." "But I didn't know. Not until the final page of the ledger, and even then, it wasn't the name that convinced me. It was the silence that followed. There were no further entries, no elaboration, just a pause as though he was waiting, watching." Armitage nodded, and the teacup, I found it near the gate, rinsed, but still bearing the faintest crack. It matched the service used at the gala. Sylvia had been clever than she knew, but panic leaves a trail, especially when the crime was not part of a plan. The inspector leaned back in his chair. "Do you believe her? That she didn't mean to kill him?" "I believe she intended harm," Miss Marple said carefully, "but not death. That distinction is important. And yet the law may not see it so kindly." "No," he sighed, "the law seldom deals with intentions." They drank their tea in thoughtful silence. Later, Miss Marple took a final walk through the village, her steps slow but assured. She passed the post office, where Mrs. Maplethorpe now stood behind the counter again, offering brief smiles and avoiding too much eye contact. Her resignation had been premature, it seemed. Forgiveness in Lower Bentham, while slow, was not impossible. She passed the Thatcham house, where Edwin sat beneath a tree in the garden, reading a newspaper and doing a rather poor job of appearing unaffected. His inheritance, such as it was, had been minor after all, a pocket watch and a public scolding. In the ledger, enough, Miss Marple thought, to change a man, though time would tell whether Edwin would allow himself to be changed. Clarissa Mott had resumed her daily walks, always in the early morning now, before the shops opened. She nodded politely to those she passed, but rarely lingered. The revelation of her past missteps had not led to condemnation, but rather an uncomfortable sympathy. The village, Miss Marple knew, had a peculiar way of deciding which sins to remember and which to let fade. The real transformation, however, had taken place in the schoolhouse. The windows were shuttered. The rooms are quiet. A substitute had been brought in from Much Willingford to finish the term, and though the children spoke of Miss Grange with confusion and sadness, they did so in the way children do with questions that fade as quickly as they form. Miss Marple lingered at the school gate a moment longer, resting her hand on the worn wooden latch. Some lessons, she thought, cannot be taught in classrooms. Back home, she sat down to write a letter to her nephew Raymond. She did not speak of poison or ledgers. Instead, she wrote of the changing leaves, of the way the robins had returned to the garden, and how the wind had taken on that familiar edge that foretold winter. Only in the final line did she mention the rest. One should never underestimate the small disturbances in seemingly tranquil places. She wrote, "It is often there, amid the tea and the tulips, that truth whispers loudest." She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it on the table beside the knitting basket, outside. The church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere a dog barked, life went on in Lower Bentham. Peace had returned, though never in the same shape as before, and Miss Marple, her eyes bright despite the gathering dusk, watched it all unfold, ever the observer. Ever the quiet sentinel of truth in a village that rarely stayed quiet for long. A week passed, then another. The village of Lower Bentham began to settle once more into its routines, as English villages do after scandal, carefully, with measured steps, as if resuming a tune that had skipped a beat. The shops reopened their doors with their usual hours, and neighbours once again paused to talk beside hedgerows or outside the grocer's, though their voices carried a slightly more restrained note than before. The red ledger, now dried and stored under lock and key at the county station, had become something of a legend. Many whispered that it contained more than had been shared, more names, more truths, more shadows best left undisturbed. Others, secretly grateful for their absence from its pages, went about their lives with an almost exaggerated sense of propriety, as if good behaviour might erase proximity to past misdeeds. Sylvia Grange had been transferred to a facility in Winchester. While the inquest was prepared, her future remained uncertain. A tribunal would determine whether she would face trial. But opinion in the village was divided. Some, like the vicar's wife, wept at the thought of a life undone by panic. Others, like Mrs. Fanshawe, declared that murder, no matter how unintended, deserved justice without exception. Miss Marple, for her part, spoke little of it. She declined to sit for the newspaper men who came sniffing about for a feature. She turned down an invitation from a publishing house to write her account. "It isn't a story to be told for entertainment," she said, "and it isn't mine to sell." Instead, she returned to the garden. The chrysanthemums were in bloom again, full and bright against the low stone walls. She tended to them each morning with quiet diligence, her clippers in hand, her mind elsewhere. It was during one such morning that young Timothy Briggs came to call. He stood awkwardly at the garden gate, shifting from foot to foot until Miss Marple looked up from her pruning. "Miss Marple," he began, clearing his throat, "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all, Timothy," she said kindly. "You look like someone with a question pressing on your chest." He flushed and stepped forward. "It's just I don't understand how you knew about Miss Grange. She seemed so ordinary." Miss Marple smiled faintly. She was ordinary, that's what made it so easy for her to be overlooked. But sometimes it's the smallest gesture that gives a person away. Not what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when they think no one is. Timothy frowned. What did she do? She picked up a teacup. Miss Marple said simply. Everyone else was rushing toward Mr. Prowse. She bent down and hid the evidence. Not because she was guilty at that moment, but because she knew, even then, what it meant. Timothy nodded slowly. "I suppose I wouldn't have noticed something like that." "Most wouldn't," she said. "It's only through years of watching and knitting. Knitting teaches one about patterns. And when a pattern breaks, when someone behaves in a way that doesn't fit, it's usually for a reason." He was silent for a moment longer, then said, "Do you think people will forgive her?" Miss Marple looked down at her chrysanthemums. "Some will, some won't. Forgiveness, you see, is a choice, and it's often tangled up with fear. People in a village like ours, people everywhere, really they'd rather hold on to judgment than admit they could have done the same in different shoes." Timothy nodded. then excused himself, leaving Miss Marple alone with the breeze and the sound of bees drifting lazily from bloom to bloom. Later that day, a letter arrived from her nephew, Raymond. The envelope bore the familiar smudged stamp from London, and the handwriting on the front was as florid and dramatic as ever. Inside was a crisp sheet of paper, a long paragraph detailing his recent writing successes, and a final note: "I do hope you haven't found yourself involved in anything frightful lately. These little villages of yours always seem so peaceful until someone ends up dead. Do write soon. Love." Miss Marple smiled, then folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. She poured herself a cup of tea, then wandered into the parlour where the autumn light fell soft through the lace curtains. The red ledger had been such a simple object: pages, ink, a binding no more remarkable than any other, and yet it had carried the weight of years. It had held truths that no one dared speak aloud. Some had called Alfred Prowse a villain, others a guardian of the village's conscience, but Miss Marple had come to think of him differently. Not a villain, not a saint, merely a man who had grown weary of silence. The tea was still warm when a knock came at the door. "And how nice that you've taken such interest in the village. I imagine it's quite different from London." "Oh, miles apart," Lavinia replied, pouring tea. "But that's the charm, isn't it? Everyone knows everyone else, such community spirit." And yet, Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, "Sometimes too much knowing can be dangerous. I imagine Mr. Prowse knew a good deal more than most." Lavinia's hand froze on the teapot handle for the briefest of moments. "Yes, I suppose he did. He had a way of remembering things others forgot, or wished forgotten," Miss Marple murmured. Lavinia looked down. "We had tea a few times. He was lonely, and perhaps I was, too. But I didn't know anything about his ledger." "I'm sure you didn't," Miss Marple said, "though one wonders if someone else thought you might have. Or perhaps, worse yet, thought Mr. Prowse might have written something about them and about you." There was a silence then, long and slow, before Lavinia whispered, "Do you think that's why he was killed?" Miss Marple rose, her expression unreadable. "I think secrets are very rarely safe in small places, Miss Fawcett, and when someone like Mr. Prowse begins writing them down, it tends to make people nervous." As she stepped outside into the cooling air, she found herself face to face with Sylvia Grange. "Oh, Miss Marple," Sylvia said quickly, "I've just come from the schoolhouse. The constable was there. He says Inspector Armitage has called an emergency meeting at the vicarage. Something about a new development. They found something. A book." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A red one?" Sylvia nodded. "Yes, in the reeds by the pond. It was waterlogged but legible. They think it's the ledger." "Then," Miss Marple said, drawing her shawl closer as the drizzle returned, "the real trouble was just beginning. The red ledger had been found." It was the headline whispered across teacups and through partially open doors, delivered with awe and a trace of dread. That afternoon, the village of Lower Bentham was not merely curious, it was electric with anticipation. Something old had surfaced, quite literally. And no one could yet say who would suffer most from its reappearance. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage just past 3, umbrella in hand, her steps unhurried, her expression unreadable. Inside, the breakfast room had once again become the centre of operations. The rain-beaten windows rattled gently in their frames, and a low murmur of conversation buzzed beneath the ceiling beams. Inspector Armitage stood near the hearth, the recovered red ledger drying carefully on a metal stand beside him. It was thick, its cover worn and faded. The corners softened by time but still unmistakably crimson. A damp patch lingered at the base where it had absorbed water, but most of the pages remained intact. Handwriting filled them in long, even lines. Alfred Prowse's neat, exacting script As Miss Marple entered, the inspector gave a short nod. Miss Marple, you've heard the news, I presume. I had it on good authority from Sylvia Grange, she replied mildly, removing her gloves. Such a valuable find, and tucked away so inconveniently. Almost as if someone had meant to dispose of it. He grimaced. That's our thinking too. It was wrapped in oilskin, likely to protect it before being dumped. A rush job. Perhaps someone was interrupted. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly, I wonder what they were trying to prevent others from reading. The inspector gestured to a nearby chair. I imagine you'll be keen to see what's inside. Only if you're inclined to share, of course, she said, settling herself gracefully. He flipped the book open with care and turned the pages until he reached a dog-eared entry. It's not a diary, mind you, more of a personal logbook. Names, dates, short notes. But here, for instance, see this, he pointed to an entry near the middle of the book. Clarissa Mott, July 1946, misused estate funds to cover gambling debt. Paid off by Miss Pomfrey to avoid scandal, Miss Marple read. The words without surprise. That explains Clarissa's silence. And her sudden generosity in inviting Mr. Prowse to the gala. There's more, Armitage said, turning a few pages. Edwin Thatcham, August 1948, diverted estate funds with Colonel's silent consent. Later blamed when discovered, left village. Under cloud, and yet, Miss Marple observed, that sounds more like complicity than guilt. The Colonel allowed it, or directed it, Armitage muttered. Another page turned. Lavinia Fawcett, March 1951, involved in inheritance dispute in London. Threatened to reveal details of Miss Pomfrey's personal history. Negotiated silence through Mr. Prowse. Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. So, Lavinia had cause to keep Mr. Prowse on her good side, or to silence him permanently, the inspector nodded. And here's the interesting bit. There's a loose page tucked in the back. He unfolded it carefully and laid it flat. Unlike the others, this one was not signed or dated. Certain individuals in Lower Bentham have forgotten that history leaves footprints. I have kept everyone. There will be no more indulgence. Names will be published. Let the guilty beware. Miss Marple tapped the edge of the page with a gloved finger. A warning, perhaps even a threat. But to whom? Before the inspector could answer, the door opened and Clarissa Mott entered, closely followed by Edwin Thatcham and Lavinia Fawcett. All three had been summoned. All three bore the look of those caught in a net not yet hauled in, but fully aware of its presence. Let's not waste time, Clarissa said briskly, removing her gloves. I suppose this is about that wretched book. Armitage closed the ledger slowly. It is. And you're right to call it wretched, Mrs. Mott. It contains rather unflattering portraits of many in this village, including all of you. Edwin raised a hand in mock surrender. Oh. Let's not pretend I'm surprised. Alfred Prowse always kept records. I imagine he had some choice words about me. Not words, Armitage replied. Facts. You and your father misappropriated funds, and when the scheme soured, he left you to take the fall. Edwin's jaw tightened. Yes, and I left rather than watch my name dragged further through the mud. Clarissa's voice cut in, brittle as glass. And yet you've come back. Just in time to collect whatever scraps Miss Pomfrey left you. Lavinia, standing slightly apart, looked from one to the other, arms folded protectively. We're not here to argue inheritance, are we, Inspector? If you had proof against one of us, you'd have acted by now. Miss Marple, who had remained quiet, now spoke. The proof lies not only in the ledger, but in its removal. The person who killed Mr. Prowse did so not for revenge, but to erase a record. Not merely to silence a man, but to make sure no one else could read what he had written. All three turned toward her. And that, she continued, suggests panic. Or perhaps guilt. Clarissa's nostrils flared. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? No, she replied. Not yet, but I must ask, why did you insist Mr. Prowse attend the gala? You hadn't invited him in years. Clarissa hesitated, then said, because I knew Edwin would be there, and I knew Alfred had leverage. I thought if he saw Edwin again, he might be more forgiving. Miss Marple's gaze turned to Edwin. And you, why return now? He shrugged. Because Miss Pomfrey died, and I wanted to pay my respects. Is that so unusual? No, Miss Marple said gently. But perhaps what is unusual is what you didn't do. You never visited Mr. Prowse, despite his role in your disgrace. Edwin hesitated. He wouldn't have seen me. Miss Marple looked at Lavinia. And you, Miss Fosdieu, spent time with Mr. Prowse shortly before his death. Did he ever mention that he intended to make his ledger public? Lavinia swallowed. He hinted, said he was tired of being polite, that people had taken advantage of his silence, and he told you this at your last meeting. She nodded slowly. The day before the gala, he was agitated. Miss Marple stood. Then it is my belief, she said quietly, that someone here believed the contents of that ledger to be dangerous enough to kill for. And when we discover who last had access to Mr. Prowse's study, and who had time enough during the gala to slip away unnoticed, we may well find our answer. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had begun to break, revealing the palest wash of blue behind them. But inside the vicarage, the air remained heavy. As the others were dismissed, one by one, Miss Marple lingered. She glanced once more at the ledger, then at the loose page. Footprints, she murmured. Yes, but not all of them lead away. And in her mind, a detail clicked into place, something she had seen, or perhaps overheard, during the gala. Not important enough to seem suspicious at the time. Not until now. Tomorrow, she will visit the scene one more time, not to search for evidence, but to follow the footprints. The following morning dawned clear at last, the clouds retreating like guilty thoughts, leaving the brittle blue sky above Lower Bentham. But despite the sunshine and the sharp tang of autumn beginning to thread through the air, the village did not breathe easily. The red ledger's return had stirred more than old secrets. It had shaken the illusion of peace that Lower Bentham had so carefully cultivated. Miss Marple rose early and dressed with her usual precision, selecting a dark grey coat and a soft woolen hat the colour of heather. She moved with quiet purpose through her morning routine, her mind not on breakfast or the weather, but on something much more elusive, a single gesture, observed days earlier, that had at the time seemed entirely unremarkable. It was Clarissa Mott, dressed in her usual impeccable fashion, though there was something less rigid in her face now. She carried a basket of scones. I thought you might be running low, she said. And I wanted to say thank you. Miss Marple accepted the basket with a gracious nod. It's a very kind gesture. Clarissa stood awkwardly for a moment before sitting across from her. I've been thinking, she said, about what we owe to the truth, about how long I let Alfred Prowse keep me quiet, and how easy it was to convince myself it was for the best. Miss Marple listened without interrupting. He knew things about all of us, Clarissa continued, and when he decided to write them down, I was furious. I thought he was trying to ruin us. But now I wonder if he simply didn't want to die holding everything inside, a heavy burden. Silence. Miss Marple said softly. Clarissa looked up. Do you think it changes anything that we all know now? I think, Miss Marple said, that knowing is the beginning of change. What you do with it, that's the part that matters. They drank their tea quietly after that, to women of different generations, bound by the knowledge of how fragile the illusion of peace could be and how precious its restoration. As evening approached and the village lights flickered on one by one, Miss Marple stood at her window and watched the gentle glow settle over Lower Bentham. The church bell rang 6 times. A bicycle clattered past, somewhere a dog barked, and A child's laughter echoed briefly before falling into stillness. She reached for her knitting, the needles clicking in a soft rhythm. Outside, the world moved forward carefully, uncertainly, but forward all the same, and within. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. There were no more murders in Lower Bentham. Not for now. It was the first truly cold morning of the season. A pale frost had crept over the village of Lower Bentham during the night, painting the rooftops and hedgerows in silvery lace. The windows of Miss Marple's cottage were steamed from the warmth within, and outside, the garden wore a thin white veil, as though dressed in remembrance rather than celebration, inside. The old clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time with a sound both reassuring and final. Miss Marple moved with her usual quiet rhythm, setting the kettle on the hob and laying out her morning correspondence. The air smelled faintly of toast and lavender polish, with a trace of last night's fire lingering in the hearth. She reached for her knitting basket, but paused before drawing the yarn. Her fingers hovered over the soft blue wool, then turned instead to the folded pages in her desk drawer, copies of her notes on the prow's matter, the torn page from the ledger now carefully transcribed in her neat handwriting. Not for anyone in particular, simply to keep the memory preserved, not erased or exaggerated. It was not a habit of vanity. Miss Marple had never considered her actions extraordinary. But she did believe that the truth, once uncovered, deserved to be gently remembered. It was the forgetting that allowed things to fester. The village had returned, outwardly at least, to its previous rhythm. There were few places in the world so skilled in the art of deliberate forgetting. New flowers had been planted beside the vicarage pond, and a fresh bench installed beneath the elm tree near the schoolhouse, replacing the old one where Sylvia Grange had once sat. Some thought it tasteless, others thought it necessary, but no one said much about it either way. The children had a new teacher, a brisk woman from the coast named Miss Elkins, who had no idea she was filling the shadow of a tragedy. She kept her lessons strict and her posture straighter than a weather vane. The children, as children do, had already begun adapting, though the smallest ones still glanced sometimes at the empty place behind the desk and wondered why Miss Grange had not come back. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard just before noon. The path was quiet, though the air had warmed enough to coax a few birds into song. She carried with her a single flower-white heather and tucked it discreetly near the edge of Alfred Prowse's newly carved headstone. It was a modest grave. The stone simply read Alfred Prowse, a keeper of records gone but not forgotten. The villagers had debated the epitaph for days. Some wanted nothing at all, others insisted on something gracious. It was Clarissa Mott, unexpectedly, who had offered the final words. "He kept our scenes," she had said, "when we refused to carry them ourselves." Miss Marple had said nothing at the time, but she had nodded, because it was true. She remained for a while by the grave. Not in mourning but in thought. The ledger had been burned, officially, on the inspector's order. No good can come of it now, he'd said, let sleeping memories lie. But Miss Marple had not needed the book to remember. She had seen enough in faces and movements, in guilt masked as propriety, and silence loud as screams. The ledger had simply been a mirror. Before leaving the churchyard, she stopped at another grave unmarked, new, not yet inscribed. It belonged to no one yet. But it was the place reserved for Sylvia Grange's family plot. Her father, a schoolteacher himself, had been buried there years earlier. Miss Marple placed a hand on the cold stone. Sylvia's tribunal would be held in a month's time. There were letters circulating already, some from parents, some from past colleagues speaking to her character, her kindness. Miss Marple had written one herself, though she had read and reread it half a dozen times before sending it. She did not set out to harm, she had written, but harm came nonetheless. The measure of justice should include the weight of regret. Whether the court would agree remained to be seen. Later that afternoon, a quiet knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Clarissa Mott, again, this time without a basket, without a pretence, just her hands tucked into the sleeves of a long coat. And her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she said as she stepped into the parlour, "about that last page of the ledger. Do you think Alfred ever meant to forgive anyone?" Miss Marple handed her a cup of tea and sat opposite. "I think he wanted them to face what they had done. Whether that's the same as forgiveness, I can't say." Clarissa looked into the fire. "I hated him for what he knew, for what he could do with it. But now I wonder if I hated him more for being right." Miss Marple said nothing. She knew some truths could only be sat with, not answered. Clarissa placed her cup down gently. "Do you think the village will ever be the same?" Miss Marple considered. "Not the same, but perhaps better. Truth can be painful, yes, but it's also freeing. We can mend what's broken, if we choose." After Clarissa left, Miss Marple sat alone for a long while. The fire crackled softly, and the last light of day filtered through the curtains. Her knitting remained untouched in her lap. Outside, a thin mist had begun to rise again, curling along the ground like a veil being drawn. A few lamps flickered on in the distance, casting golden halos into the growing dusk. She rose at last, walking to the window. The village lay beneath the early dark, unchanged in its appearance, yet subtly altered in its soul. Somewhere a bell chimed, somewhere else a door closed. Miss Marple smiled to herself gently, quietly, not because all was well, but because, for the moment, all was known, and for Miss Marple that was always enough. That's why he came, after all. Not for the flowers or the sponge cake. He came for someone. Clarissa rose suddenly, crossing to the window. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Miss Marple said, rising too, "I want to see how you respond." Clarissa turned, startled. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "guilt reveals itself in many ways. Panic, denial, but sometimes it reveals itself through protectiveness. Through silence." She stepped closer. "You protected Edwin, and I believe you would protect others too, especially if you thought they had made a mistake, even a fatal one." Clarissa looked at her, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "There was someone else near the pond that day," Miss Marple said. "Someone Mr. Prowse had written about that in that missing page. Someone who had more to lose than even you. More, perhaps, than Edwin." Clarissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I know who it is," Miss Marple said softly, "but I need to be sure. I need to see how far someone would go to protect them." Even now, Clarissa's eyes welled suddenly. She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple stepped back, allowing the moment to settle. "I will ask you just one thing, Clarissa. Did you find a torn page inside that cup when you rinsed it?" Clarissa turned, stunned. "How did you do?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Because it's where I would have hidden it, if I were afraid someone might come looking." Clarissa crossed the room, opened a drawer in the sideboard, and retrieved a small, folded piece of paper. "It's not signed," she said, "but I know the handwriting." Miss Marple took the page carefully. She didn't open it. "Not yet, thank you." "Clarissa, you won't tell?" Miss Marple gave her a look of gentle resolve. "That depends on what it says." She returned to her cottage just as the sun reached its peak, casting light through the lace curtains. She placed the teacup and the torn page side by side on her writing desk and took a deep breath before unfolding the slip of paper. There it was, a single name, written in Mr. Prowse's neat, final hand, one name, and it was not Clarissa, it was not Edwin, it was someone no one would have suspected. Someone who had played the role of innocence with great precision. Miss Marple set the page down and folded her hands. The time for questions had passed. Tomorrow she will call upon the final suspect, not with evidence, but with understanding. And she would wait to see what they confessed without even knowing they had done so. The next morning came with a strange stillness. Not the hush of sleep or the quiet of contentment, but the kind of pause the world takes when it senses something is about to change. The sky hung over Lower Bentham in a soft silver veil. Neither bright nor threatening, just waiting. Miss Marple spent the early hours in quiet preparation. There was no rush. She brewed her tea, buttered a scone, and fed the birds in her garden. Only then did she slip the folded paper, the torn page from Alfred Prowse's ledger, into the small envelope she kept for correspondence of a delicate nature. It bore no address. It wouldn't need one. By 10:30, she was walking the narrow lane past the schoolhouse, the trees lining the path already tinged with the season's first rust. She wore her green wool coat and a hat pinned neatly above her curls. From a distance, she might have looked like any elderly lady out for a morning constitutional, but in truth, she walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally reached the end of a long, winding path. At the schoolhouse gate, she paused, watching as a familiar figure appeared at the top of the steps, arms full of books and folders. Sylvia Grange. The schoolmistress looked as though she hadn't slept, her face drawn and pale, her eyes rimmed with the kind of weariness that came not from work, but from worry. Still, she smiled when she saw Miss Marple, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," Sylvia said, adjusting the papers in her arms. "Out enjoying the weather? I rather hope to see you," Miss Marple said gently, "if you have a moment." Sylvia glanced back at the schoolhouse door, then nodded. "Of course, I was just finishing some markings. The children are off today for the half-term holiday." They walked together to the small bench beneath the elm tree, the same place where Sylvia had sat with her after Alfred Prowse's death. The breeze whispered through the leaves, sending one or two to spiral lazily to the ground. Miss Marple waited until they were both seated before she spoke again. "I know it's been a difficult week." "My dear," Sylvia looked down at her lap. "It has for everyone," Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but perhaps especially for you." There was a pause. "I remember," Miss Marple continued, "that you were the first to find Mr. Prowse. You screamed, ran to him. You told us his eyes were wide open, and that the cup had been flung away." Sylvia's voice was quiet. "Yes, it all happened so fast, and you seemed so shocked, so distressed. Almost as though the sight of death was something entirely new to you." Sylvia frowned. It was, "I've never seen someone die before." Miss Marple studied her face. "Are you sure?" Sylvia turned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the envelope. She placed it gently on the bench between them. "This," she said, "was found inside the teacup that someone hid near the vicarage gate. I believe it was placed there in haste, when the realization struck that the red ledger might not have been the only incriminating item." Sylvia looked at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. "I've read it," Miss Marple said. "It's from Alfred Prowse. A torn page from his ledger. He removed it before the gala, perhaps intending to deal with its contents privately." Sylvia's voice was barely audible. "And whose name was on it?" Miss Marple's tone remained soft. "Yours." Sylvia closed her eyes. "He wrote that you'd forged references to gain your post here in Lower Bentham, that you were dismissed from a school in Hastings 2 years ago following the sudden death of a student in your care." A trembling breath escaped Sylvia's lips. "He never reported it," Miss Marple continued. "He kept it to himself. Perhaps he pitied you, or perhaps he intended to use it, should the occasion arise. That, I believe, was his mistake." Sylvia finally looked up, her eyes glistening. "I didn't mean for it to happen in Hastings. It was an accident. The boy had asthma. He collapsed during a nature walk. I panicked. I hadn't been trained properly. It all spiraled. And so you left," Miss Marple said, "and came here." "I needed a fresh start," Sylvia said, her voice cracking. "I was doing well, the children like Me, I never meant to harm anyone, but when Mr. Prowse discovered the truth, Sylvia's hands gripped the edge of the bench. He said he wouldn't tell, not if I promised to stay out of trouble, but at the gala, he told me he was changing his mind. He said the village deserved to know. That he was tired of protecting people like me, he was going to put it in the ledger, make it official. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He left for the pond, Sylvia whispered, and I followed. I had a vial something I kept for emergencies, a sedative. I'd never used it like that before, I swear. But I put it in his tea when no one was looking. Tears now ran freely down her cheeks. I thought it would just make him drowsy. I didn't know it would kill him. But when he collapsed, I realized what I'd done, and then I saw the cup and panicked. I picked it up. Rinsed it in the garden tap. Hide it near the gate. I didn't know what else to do. Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment, allowing the truth to settle between them. You could have run, she said eventually. I wanted to, Sylvia replied, but I was afraid. And I thought perhaps no one would ever know. Miss Marple took her hand. I do not believe you are a wicked person, Miss Grange, but you made a terrible mistake. And then another, in trying to hide it. You must come forward. Sylvia's shoulders sagged. Will they arrest me? That, Miss Marple said gently, will be for Inspector Armitage to decide. But you will not be alone. She stood and helped the young woman to her feet. As they walked together toward the vicarage, the leaves continued to fall in soft, lazy spirals. The truth, at last, had emerged not with drama or declarations, but with quiet, painful honesty. And as Miss Marple led Sylvia through the garden gate, she thought not of justice, but of mercy, of how thin the line could be between a life ruined and a life forgiven. Somewhere behind them, the village of Lower Bentham carried on its secrets, now one fewer. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that peace was not the absence of scandal, it was the strength to face it, and that, perhaps, was the legacy Mr. Prowse had truly left behind. The news, when it finally spread through Lower Bentham, did so with the swiftness and subtlety of spring frost on a window pane. Quietly, delicately, and then all at once, Miss Sylvia Grange, the bright new schoolmistress with the shy smile and thoughtful eyes, had confessed to her role in the death of Alfred Prowse. It was not murder in the usual sense, villagers murmured, not a crime of hatred or greed. It was, if one was inclined to believe the kinder versions, a terrible mistake, made worse by fear. But of course, fear rarely satisfied the public appetite. For justice, Inspector Armitage had taken Sylvia into custody with a solemnity that bordered on regret. He had questioned her once more, confirming the details of her confession. Then telephoned the chief constable in Much Willingford. She was not formally charged, not yet she would face a tribunal. That much was clear. The village, meanwhile, reeled in the aftermath, not only because of the crime itself, but because the culprit had been so normal, so familiar. It had been at the gala, near the moment the alarm was raised, amidst the chaos, as Sylvia Grange cried out and people ran toward the pond. Miss Marple had seen someone pick something up from the grass quickly, almost instinctively, and slip it into a pocket. She could not remember who, only the shape of the movement, but now, in light of the recovered ledger, that forgotten detail gnawed at her. If it had been the missing teacup, then it was very likely the killer. She resolved to return to the vicarage garden one final time. By mid-morning, Miss Marple stood once more beside the pond, the grass still flattened in places, the flowers trying valiantly to reclaim their upright grace. The constable posted nearby offered her a polite nod but did not interfere. Miss Marple's presence, by now, had become something of a fixture in the investigation. Quietly tolerated even if not officially welcomed, she knelt with care beside the flower bed. The trail of red powder had long since disappeared, washed away by rain, but Another trace remained pressed faintly into the soft earth, halfway between the pond and a rose bush. A footprint, not made by a heavy man, nor a leather-soled boot. Something lighter, narrower. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly, sweeping the surrounding area. Another partial print led away toward the side gate of the vicarage, one not typically used during the gala. She followed the path with slow steps, stopping only when she reached a low shrub partially obscuring the gate. Something glinted beneath it. Bending carefully, she reached down and withdrew the object, a porcelain teacup hairline crack along the rim, floral pattern matching the set from the gala. It had been rinsed, only a faint trace of tea remained. Inside, Miss Marple turned it in her hands. No lipstick, no residue of cyanide, but the cracket hadn't been there on the cups at the beginning of the party. She remembered because she'd complimented Mrs. Harmond on their pristine condition. Someone had dropped it, or perhaps gripped it too tightly in a moment of stress. She placed it in her bag, wrapped in a handkerchief, and continued her walk along the garden's perimeter, her thoughts returning to the ledger's final, ominous page, "Let the guilty beware." That line, she now realized, had not been a warning. To the world, it had been bait, a trap laid by a dying man. Back in the village, word of the ledger's contents continued to stir unease. 3 more names had been revealed that morning, including that of Mrs. Maplethorpe, who had apparently overcharged several elderly clients at the post office for years. She had retired from her duties that very afternoon, claiming exhaustion. But more shocking still was the revelation that had emerged quietly, almost accidentally, from the final pages. A name not listed earlier, a name no one had expected. Reverend Harmond. Miss Marple sat with him in his study later that afternoon, the fire burning low. The curtains drawn against the brightness outside. "I had no idea," she said softly, "not until I read the entry myself." The Reverend, usually so composed, so earnest, looked 10 years older than he had just days before. His hands trembled in his lap. "I hoped it had all been forgotten." He whispered, "It was decades ago. I was barely out of university. I mismanaged a trust fund for a parish orphanage, used some of the money to cover debts. Gambling, I'm ashamed to say." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, and Mr. Prowse knew, he discovered it when I came here to Lower Bentham, said he wouldn't tell anyone as long as I served the village well. He kept me honest, until he decided not to keep secrets any more. The Reverend nodded. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, I swear to you." "I believe you," she said, "but someone feared exposure more than you did, and now that the ledger has returned, I fear they may not be finished." Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Sylvia Grange at the schoolhouse. The young teacher looked pale, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "I found the cup," Miss Marple said gently. Near the side gate, Sylvia sat down hard in her chair. Then, "You know, I suspect, but I don't know." Sylvia's voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw her pick it up. I didn't tell anyone. I thought maybe I imagined it." "Who?" She hesitated, then Clarissa. After everyone ran to the pond, she bent down and grabbed something from the ground. It was quick, as if she didn't want to be noticed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It may have been nothing, or it may have been the cup. What does that mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Clarissa may have discovered the poisoned cup first. And rather than report it, she may have hidden it to protect someone." Sylvia's voice was barely audible. "Edwin, perhaps, or perhaps someone else entirely." That night, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat beside her fire with the teacup on the table beside her. She stared at it for a long time, considering. Mr. Prowse had known he was in danger. The final note in the ledger had been placed there for a reason. Not to threaten, to provoke. He had hoped, perhaps, that fear would flush his enemies into the open. But he had underestimated the depth of desperation. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, did not always belong to villains. Sometimes it belonged to those trying to protect someone they loved. She turned to her notebook and made a final, quiet note. Tomorrow she will visit Clarissa Mott, not with accusations, but with a simple question, one that, if answered wrongly, might reveal everything, not what was written in the ledger, but what had been missing. The morning was still when Miss Marple made her way to the Thatcham house. A faint mist hung over the hedgerows, softening the outlines of rooftops and fences, making the familiar scene ghostly. It was the sort of weather that cloaks secrets, where truths could slip through the fog as easily as footsteps on damp earth. Miss Marple's walk was measured, steady. In one hand she carried her handbag, and in the other a wrapped parcel containing the porcelain teacup she had found near the vicarage pond. The crack in the rim, barely visible unless one was looking for it, had become her silent witness. Clarissa Mott greeted her at the door with a cool expression and the faintest trace of reluctance. Her grey silk blouse was crisply pressed, and not a strand of her hair dared stray from the twist pinned tightly behind her head. "Miss Marple," she said with a polite dip of her chin, "I must admit I wasn't expecting visitors this early." "I do apologize," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside with the mild insistence that often passed unnoticed until it was too late. "I thought it best we speak in private, while the air is still clear." Clarissa led her to the sitting room, where the heavy curtains remained drawn against the light. A decanter sat on the sideboard, though untouched, and the fireplace had been laid but not yet lit. "Tea?" Clarissa asked. "No, thank you, my dear," said Miss Marple, taking her seat. "I won't stay long. I've simply brought something I thought you might recognize." She placed the parcel gently on the table and unwrapped it, revealing the floral teacup. Clarissa's eyes flickered just once, a brief spark too quick to be called surprise, too faint to be called fear. "I found it," Miss Marple said softly, "near the vicarage gate, wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked under a shrub. It had been rinsed, of course, but not well enough to erase all questions." Clarissa's voice remained steady. "A cup, you think? It's important." "I believe it was the one Mr. Prowse drank from," Miss Marple said. "The cup the poison was in." Clarissa folded her hands in her lap. "And you think I hid it there?" "I don't think," Miss Marple said kindly. "Not until I'm sure. But I do wonder why someone would go to the trouble of removing it, unless they feared what it might reveal." Clarissa looked away, her mouth tightening. Miss Marple waited. Silence settled in the room, broken only by the distant sound of a lorry passing on the main road. Then Clarissa turned back to face her guest, her gaze sharper now, laced with something more personal. "I didn't kill Alfred," she said, "but I did find the cup. After it happened, after he collapsed, he saw it on the ground, near the petunias. I picked it up because I knew the questions would come, and I didn't want them to lead to Edwin. So you did it for him." Clarissa hesitated. "For the family. For the name. Edwin's been foolish, yes. But he's not a murderer." Miss Marple nodded. Slowly. "That is something we agree on." Clarissa blinked. "You do?" "I've never believed Edwin guilty," Miss Marple said gently. "His flaws are many, but he lacks one crucial quality found in all successful poisoners: patience and discretion." A small, humorless laugh escaped Clarissa's lips. "You're right about that." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "But you are not the only one who might have feared exposure." Clarissa stilled. "Tell me," Miss Marple continued, "do you remember if anything was missing from the ledger?" Clarissa frowned. "I didn't read it. I couldn't." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "but I did. There's something strange about it. The entries stop short. The last page has no date. It speaks of secrets being revealed, of names to come, but no names follow. It's as if the ledger was interrupted mid-thought." Clarissa's expression changed then. Her gaze dropped, her hands folded tighter. "I think Mr. Prowse had written one more name." Miss Marple said, but removed it before the party. A page, perhaps, torn out. Maybe he was giving the person a chance, or perhaps he meant to confront them that day.